Hello and welcome to part 2 of working with water-soluble fabrics. Today is all about how to create 3D sculptures. The first one is essentially just made out of thread, and the second 3D sculpture will be incorporating other fibers and doing more of a freestyle design. The placement on my design, I first cut out a circle from some scrap cardboard. Then I divided the circle into 8 segments. I bent my cardboard to get it to be evenly spaced, but that's up to you entirely. Next up, we're going to cut up a section of our water-soluble fabric stabilizer. For purposes of this tutorial, we're just going to call it water-soluble fabric. So you want to cut your piece slightly bigger than the embroidery hoop that you're going to be using. So when you're placing your water-soluble fabric in your hoop, you need it to be as tight and as taut as possible. So when you drum your fingers on it, it needs to make a tight popping sound, not a dull thud. And then obviously also remember to tighten the screw of your embroidery hoop as tight as it can possibly go. So just keep tightening your fabric without tearing it, because it does tear fairly easily depending on the type that you're using. I like to use a water-soluble pen to draw my design onto the water-soluble fabric. You could also use a pencil, but just be aware that if you need to make sure that the pen you're using to draw your design is lighter colored than the thread that you're going to be using, because if you're using a ballpoint pen, there's a good chance that that color from the pen is going to transfer onto your thread work when you're finally done. So first draw your 8 spokes, and then you're going to draw circles. So the inner circle that you draw is going to be the diameter of the base of the object that you're going to be molding over. And then you need to draw circles sort of a few centimeters up from that, sort of midway between the base and the top of the object that you're molding over. And these circular lines will just give you some stitching guides to work by. Alright, so next up we're going to get to the free motion embroidery. So you want to make sure you've set your machine up properly. In other words, you have to have your embroidery foot on your machine. The feed dogs, the fabric guides, need to be disengaged, and your machine needs to be set to straight stitch. So your tension needs to be slightly lower than normal, and make sure that you're using a size 80 needle or even smaller. I like to use a size 60 with my water-soluble fabrics, but that's just a personal choice. So to start with, make sure you've got your thread on the top of the design that you're working with, both threads. So we're going to be doing straight lines, the straight line stitching first. You want to go over all of these straight lines at least twice. You'll probably find that by the time you've finished your design, you're going to have gone over them at least 4 times. But to start with, make sure that you've gone over each of these straight lines at least twice. And remember, of course, that because it's free motion embroidery, one of the wonderful things is that you can literally go any direction you want. So use this to get yourself out of any binds that you might find yourself on when you're working with the straight lines of the design. so all the straight lines are done, so we can start the leaves that go between the spokes. The leaves on the inside ring, the smallest ring, it's very important that these leaves do not touch each other. So the first round of leaves, don't let them touch each other. And as you're stitching, you're going to be stitching in a circular motion. So you want to make sure that your stitching is really, really dense, because remember, that's all there is to this design. All this fabric is going to be dissolving away. So make sure that you're going round and round in little tiny circles and going over your stitching many, many times to create a nice compact leaf of stitches. So for my middle round of leaves, I did those two middle rings quite close to each other. Those are my guidelines for the stitching. So you might want to do that as well. It's all entirely up to you how even you want your leaves to be. So now we're moving up our design to the next set of leaves. So the leaves at the top of the spokes also must not touch each other. It's very important that only the middle round of leaves touch each other in this design. So you'll see when we start doing the next spokes, what I'm saying will start to make a bit more sense. But for now, just remember that these leaves need to be kept even size. The inner ring can be a slightly smaller, but for the rest of them need to be kept an even size. Then as I'm moving back down the spoke, down the stem of the leaves that I've just done, just do a little single line of stitching through the middle of each leaf, just to make very sure that everything is very well securely attached to each other. So for the next line of leaves, or next spoke of leaves, should I say, I did not do the small little leaf at the very bottom of the spoke. I've gone straight into doing the middle leaves, because we don't want there to be too much stitching down at the base of our design. So you can see here where I'm joining the two middle leaves together, just at the tips, just the two tips need to touch each other, because that's going to form the ring of our design. Okay, so I'm going to speed up my filming after the sleeve, because this whole thread design took me half an hour to stitch. So in order to save you some sanity, I've sped up the video from this point until we finish the stitching. And with that, all of our stitching is complete. As you can see, I've left a little gap between those leaves at about the 2 o'clock position, if you're looking at the design. This is intentional. And now we get to the really fun part. So first off, we're going to cover our mold in plastic wrap. This is a good idea if you're going to be leaving your mold overnight. If you want to use a hairdryer to dry your mold, then you probably just need, yeah, I wouldn't use the plastic wrap part. Just as you're going, you probably want to loosen your mold, your design from your mold as you're going. But I prefer to use cover my mold in plastic wrap and then leave my design overnight just to make sure that everything is as secure as it possibly can be. So once you've cut off all the excess of the water-soluble fabric, you're going to dip it into lukewarm water. You don't want to leave it too long. I actually did leave this design a little bit too long in the water, so I ended up having to fix that afterwards, but it's kind of a good thing because I can show you how I did that. So put a towel or something underneath the mold, because there is going to be quite a bit of water runoff to start with. So because I used embroidery thread on the top of my design and ordinary thread on the bobbin, I need to make sure that I've got the correct side of my design on the outside. And then just want to make sure that all the leaves and all the design elements lie completely straight, because this is the point where your design is going to be fixed into its shape. So make sure that everything is lying exactly as you want it to be. Then overnight in front of the radiator. It's winter after all. So when you're making these thread sculptures, you must remember that the more of the backing fabric that you wash out, if you wash it all the way out, it becomes quite soft. So the way to counteract that, if it has happened, is to use good old hairspray. Okay. So yeah, get the strongest one that you can. The cheaper, it doesn't really matter. It really doesn't. Yeah. You don't need good hairspray for this. You just need hairspray. And then, yeah, you put it in the shape that you want and give it a spritz. And then it'll add to the stiffness of the item. The other trick, of course, would be to use a spray-on starch. Or you could make your own starch out of, I think it's corn flour and water. There's tutorials for that. But if you need to, just reshape your item. Give it a spritz with the hairspray. And it very quickly dries. And that'll just give you a little bit more stability to your thread sculpture. Okay, so here's the final stages. You can see where these two leaves overlap. I'm just going to put a little stitch in there just to hold that together. Right. So that was the gap that we left in our stitching. You don't have to leave this gap. I'll show you in a minute. The one where I just did it around the vessel. So really I'm just going to do 2 stitches into that one. Cuts. And there's my little, oops, I was going to twist it, there we go. There's my little leaf bowl. If I wanted that a bit stiffer, I could obviously spray it with a spray varnish. Put it back onto its mold and just spritz the top with some spray varnish, and it will hold it even more. It'll even make it even stiffer. But I'm happy with that for now, because that's holding its shape nicely. So our next type of 3D thread sculpture is a bit more freeform. So for this one, we're not going to be using our embroidery hoop as we did before. This one is done with 2 layers of the water-soluble fabric. So start by measuring your vessel. As you'll see later in the video, I got a bit carried away, but this was the vessel that I started with. Basically, you want the circle at the bottom, the size of your diameter of your vessel, and then I chose to do mine in 4 strips. You could, of course, just do 1 strip that wraps around the whole shape. But for mine, I chose to do mine in sort of more of a cross formation. So I was going to use an embroidery hoop, which is why I measured it to that size, but then realized afterwards that this water-soluble fabric is actually thick enough for me not to have to use the hoop. It all depends on the fiber that you're using, the water-soluble fabric. Some of them are really thin and flimsy, So for those ones, you will need to use your hoop, but mine is stiff enough not to have to. So you start. So you need to cut two pieces that are the same size, and then you want to draw out your design onto one of those pieces. Um, yeah, I use a water-soluble fabric because, as I explained in the previous one, the color of your pen can show up on the threads that you're using. So to be sure, just use a water-soluble fabric marker or a pencil. Right, so lay out the part that you drew on, the side that you drew on, and I'm going to start with putting little fine tufts of wool roving over those shapes. I'm going to create a nice even layer of fibers. I'm using a few different shades of blue for mine. This is entirely a personal choice. You can use one color. You can do them even much finer than this if you wanted to, if you're trying to create something that's very, very fine. I like to have a little bit more fiber on my works just to make sure that it holds its shape. But again, this is entirely a personal choice. So just keep layering your fibers until you've got the color scheme that you're looking for. Okay, so we've laid out all our fibers. Now next up, I want to add some bling. You could of course use sequins because the sewing machine can stitch through sequins, but I can't find mine. So I'm recycling a bit of ribbon from a Christmas wrapping, present topper from Christmas. So just cut that up into tiny little pieces. It's just to add a little bit of sparkle to my design. This is purely a personal choice because I'm doing sort of like a seascape idea. So yeah, just cut up a bit of silver ribbon for some bling. But like I said, this is completely personal, and you can of course use sequins instead. Right, so because I'm sticking to my sort of seaweed waterscape scene, I'm laying out strips or lengths of crochet thread and wool that will run up the length of my vessel. These are not essential, but I do find that it helps to add a bit of structure to my design. So I usually, when I'm doing thread sculptures, I'll lay out threads that run the length of the design. It's entirely up to you. If you want to have a really flimsy design that doesn't have the threads in, you don't need to do this. It just depends on how fine of effect you want. But for this particular design, I'm laying out blue cotton crochet thread, purple cotton crochet thread, and then I'm also going to put some blue, just ordinary cotton yarn strips into it as well. Yeah, and then just for added effect, I put some balls of wool roving, pale lilac wool roving, around my design. These will be stitched sort of in a spiral design once I'm doing my actual stitching, just to hold them in place. This creates quite a nice effect, especially if you're trying to do flowers, or in my case, it just sort of adds to the seascape effect. Yeah, we finished placing down all of our fibers and things we want trapped into the design. I'm going to lay our final layer of water-soluble fabric on top. You need to make sure that this is in the right place, because you obviously can't lift it up and shift it without shifting all your fibers underneath. So just make sure that it's where it needs to be. And now you're going to pin all around the places, put pins, sorry, in all the places where you're not going to be stitching. Don't put too many pins to actually inhibit your ability to stitch freely, but at the same time you need to make sure that all those fibers are going to be held in place so that we can stitch them down soon. So our machine's obviously set up for free motion embroidery, as per the previous thread sculpture we were doing. So make sure your threads are both on the top of your design before you start stitching, just to make sure that nothing's getting trapped underneath. Now you're going to work circular, well, basically you can do your lines of stitching any way you like. I like to do sort of curly circular designs running up the length of the design of my vessel, just to make sure that that all the fibers are getting trapped. You could of course do a grid design, you could do any which way, anything that's running up and down the length of your design and trapping your fibers in place as much as possible. And of course, anytime that you come to one of those balls of roving that you did, you want to be making a spiral design around it, as I'm doing at the moment, just to make sure that that little ball of roving gets nicely trapped in with the rest of the fibers. Okay, and we've finished our stitching of the stitching all the fibers down. I'm going to leave some of my threads quite long because I like the effect. It sort of adds to the whole stringy, seaweedy sort of effect of the design. Again, that's purely because of the design I'm doing. You could also cut these short if you wanted to. Right, now we come to the dissolving part, which is great fun. So cut your design, your pieces of your design out. Cut off as much of the water-soluble backing that you can without cutting any of your fibers. You don't want to leave too much of that backing behind because otherwise by the time you've dissolved it all, you've ended up dissolving too much of the backing of the actual design. And you want to keep some of that sort of backing, although it'll be dissolved. If it's not completely dissolved, the stiffness of it will help to hold the vessel's shape. So you really want to be careful not to leave your design in the water too long when you're doing vessels that are this big. So as I did my design much too long for my bottle, as you can see, I've had to find an alternative vessel, which turns out to be a can of spray paint. So I'm going to cover that with plastic wrap, as one does for one's mold. And now we come to the dissolving part. So again, I'm using lukewarm water, and I'm starting with the part that's got the circle and the long piece attached to it. So that'll be the first piece that I start with. So for this one, I really want to make sure that we don't wash out too much of that backing, because as I was saying a second ago, we want that stiffness. So really we're just taking off the excess on the outside and then start the draping it around your shape. Okay, so you need to make sure that the second piece that you're going to lay on there and all the other pieces are going to overlap nicely. So that's just to make sure that it all holds together once it's dry. So make sure you've got a really good overlap, especially at the base for the second part. And then parts 2 and 3, you're going to want to make sure that they overlap these first two pieces on the sides very well. Okay, and then because my vessel has the plastic wrap underneath it, and it's not quite laying as flat as I'd like it to be, I'm going to just use the bottle that I was going to use as my mold. Just put a little plastic wrap on the bottom, and then put that on top of the base like that, just to let it dry completely flat. Okay, so I've left, yeah, like I said, I left it overnight next to the radiator. The cling film really did stick very well to the spray can. So yeah, it took me about 5 minutes to gently ease the sculpture off its form. I'm going to speed this up because I'm sure you don't want to watch me struggling for 5 minutes. But essentially, I was using yeah, as much as possible, used the cling film to loosen it, tried twisting it a bit, and then I even got a skewer involved. So yeah, it can be tricky to get the sculpture off the form. So just be patient and then just gently ease it off. And finally, it's free. Took a while, but we got there eventually. And there you've got your 3D vessel. Yeah, you can see it from all angles. Sorry about that, I shot this in portrait shot, but I couldn't get it to fit in the landscape once I'd finished. And as always, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial and look forward to sharing some more tutorials with you next week. Thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.